Carlo, Pietro, Giovanni, Guglielmo, Tebaldo was born on March 3rd, 1882, in Italy, to a once wealthy mom and dad. However, by the time he was born, they had lost most of their wealth, and he had grown up almost in poverty. And as he grew into a young adult, he had kept hearing about the opportunities that lie in America. He had heard over and over again about the American dream and desired to come to America, and eventually made his way here with only about $200 in his pocket. By the time he actually got shore, having had to, of course, ride the boat, right, to ride a ship over. By the time he got to shore, he only had about $2.50. And so he began his American excursion. He went from job to job to job, either getting fired from one or quitting before he got fired. He could not hold down a job, but eventually he did meet his wife, the woman who would become his wife. They got married, and then he started to work for the family business, from this person's business and into that person's business. And it was during this time where he was working for his wife's family in an import-export business that he finally caught his big break. He received an envelope with an international reply coupon, often used for international pen pals or international orders like this one here. It was sent from one country in order to receive the goods from another country. So basically, the person wanting a reply would go to their country's post office, a post office in their own country. They would buy their own stamp in order to get the mail sent over to that other country. And at the same time, then they would buy another stamp that they would stuff in an envelope or some package, so that when it got to that other country, they would be able to take that stamp to their own local post office, trade it in for that country's postage, and then if there was anything left over, they would get the change in return so they could send it back. Carlo realized that this actually could be pretty lucrative if he could get the exchange rates correct. So he would go to a U.S. post office, a local post office. He would buy a stamp to be able to send over to another partner in some other country, who would then take the IRC, the International Response Coupon, or reply coupon, and he would then take it to his local post office, but rather than switching it out for a local postage stamp, he would just get the money for it. He would just exchange it for the money. And then he would take a portion of it, send the rest of it back to Carlo. This worked out great. He was making quite a bit of money by doing this. But then the post office caught on, and they suspended his account. No longer could he do this. And now he was up the creek without a paddle. He didn't know what to do. Because not only was he doing this, but then in order to gain more money, he was actually bringing investors in. He wasn't telling them exactly what he was doing, because that was kind of shady, but he was promising that they would make a lot of money if they would go into business with him, and so they did. Well, now all of a sudden, the USPS has cut off his account. He needs money to be able to send it back and give it back to his investors. So he acquired newer investors, and then he would take the money from the newer investors to pay off the old investors. And this worked for a while, until the Boston Post did a couple of exposés on Carlo. And then all of a sudden, once again, he was up the creek without a paddle, because his newer investors saw what was going on and decided they weren't going to invest in his company any longer. And now he had no money to pay off his older investors. And so here we have Carlo, Pietro, Giovanni, Guglielmo, Tebaldo, and did I forget to mention his last name? Ponzi. found to be a schemer and a fraud. Surprisingly, though, Ponzi did not go to jail for bilking investors out of $15 million, which would be equivalent to $235 million today. Ponzi went to jail for mail fraud. He got out just a few years later. He almost disappeared off the face of the earth, but then was found to live in Brazil, where he died with about $75 to his name. The American dream had caught up with Carlo Ponzi. And when the American dream catches up with us, if that is what we are seeking after, we will find either we or the people that we know will do many horrifying things to make it stick. Or as Paul wrote in 1 Timothy, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. This morning we're looking at what God has to say about wealth from the perspective of the most wealthiest human being to have ever existed on the planet. Solomon accumulated so much money that you would have to take the combined amount of wealth from Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Mark Zuckerberg, and Larry Page, the 5 wealthiest men in America, and then double it to have what Solomon had. Solomon seems to have, though, figured out the principle of wealth when he was writing Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes as well. This is throughout these books of wisdom. It was a principle that really doesn't get lived out in the world today. Not even usually by believers of God's word. And it's basically that we ought to dedicate our wealth to God. We are to dedicate it. We are to live our lives in the model of this principle. And just like we just saw from Michael when he was reading, Solomon calls on us to dedicate that wealth, and we do that through 3 actions that aren't optional. If we are wanting to live by the principle that Solomon has built up, this biblical principle, then we ought to then make sure that we are living according to these 3 necessary actions and do so constantly in order to live a life where our wealth doesn't control us, but we control it. The first is that we are to dedicate our wealth to God's glory, for God's glory. We dedicate our wealth for God's glory. The second, we are to dedicate our wealth for God's gifting. And then lastly, we dedicate our wealth for God's greatness. God's glory, God's gifting, God's greatness. And the first action that we see that we need to take if we want to dedicate our wealth to God is to actually dedicate it for His glory. But here's the thing, most Christians don't do this. Like I said, we typically don't live according to this principle. We don't actually dedicate our money for God's glory. Typically, if you've been in church long enough, you will probably think about the idea of first fruits, which is one thing that Michael had just read as well. But we typically think about the first fruits. We think about the tithes. We think about the offerings. And so if we are good Christians, right? If we're good Christians, then we will take whatever it is, and we'll, there's this debate about whether it's supposed to be gross or whether it's supposed to be net. But we will take that and we will set it aside and go, that is for God. That is for His glory. That is for God's use. And then the rest of this basically is for me. Now, theologically, we may not necessarily believe that, but practically speaking, that's exactly what we do. We will set aside this money over here. That's for God. That's for His glory. This is for pragmatic use. This is for what I need to survive on. So God's over there, mine's over here, and we have basically developed this two-story system that there is holy money out there for God's use for missions and for church work and for outreach and for evangelism, that kind of thing. There's that money right there. There's that up in the upper story, and then down in the lower story is basically what we would call filthy money, filthy lucre, or pagan money, or profane money. It's used for everything else. It's for mortgages and utilities and gasoline and clothes, entertainment, retirement, and so forth. But my question is, what would it look like if we actually tore down the ceiling that separated the holy from the profane? What would that look like for us? There was just one story in which all money was holy. What would that look like? What would life be like for us if we just stopped for a few moments every time that we received a paycheck in the bank or got our retirement or something from our 401k? What would happen if we just stopped for a moment, looked at that money that all of a sudden we see in our checking account and go, Lord, all of this, 100% of this money is yours. And I want to dedicate this money for your glory. What would happen if that was our thought process? That we would take not just even our money, but then we would look at our homes and our automobiles, the clothes that are on our back and in our drawers at home, and go, Lord, this home is yours for your glory. These clothes are yours for your glory. I can't help but think of Les Miserables and the priest in Les Miserables. If you know the story, you know that Jean Valjean, escaped convict, goes into the priest's house, is welcomed there. He's not technically an escaped convict yet. He is released. But he steals from the priest, who has already told him that it was all his. Anything that he needed was his. He steals from him, gets caught by the police, comes back, escorted by the police, who say, he said that all of this is his, that all these things that he has in his bag is yours. He says, yes, it is. But you have forgotten one thing. And he goes and gets the candlesticks and he brings them back to him. And he says, these are yours as well. Police are incredulous, but they let him go into his custody. And he asks them why he had to steal. It was all his anyway, anything that he needed. Because the priest had already realized that everything that he has in this home wasn't really his, but it was there for the glory of God. And so he held on to it very loosely. What would happen if that was our mindset? I think there would be a couple of changes there. I think we would spend a little bit of time actually contemplating how we actually are using our resources that God has given to us. Maybe I shouldn't buy this. Maybe I actually should buy that. Maybe I shouldn't buy anything and just hold on to this money. We would rethink about how we were going to use these resources for God that God has given to us. But then, secondly, we will make decisions about our wealth, whether that's our income or whether that is our home or what have you. We would make these decisions about our wealth that others would find odd or even infuriating. Such is the case with Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus. A little bit before this incident that we're going to go to, and if you want to, you can go with me to Luke chapter 10. But a little bit before this incident, Mary and Martha hosted Jesus and the disciples as they were going on their way. And Jesus began to teach, and Mary sat down at Jesus' feet while Martha was up and about serving. And Martha, of course, gets angry. We probably know this story. Martha gets angry with Mary for sitting there and doing nothing. It's not only that she wasn't helping Martha out, but it was against protocol. It was against tradition for women and men to learn at the same time. It was wrong for a woman then to sit at the feet of a rabbi in the midst of men. And so she goes to Jesus and says to Jesus, Jesus, would you not tell Mary to get up and start helping me here? I'm kind of swamped here. And then Jesus says in chapter 10, Luke chapter 10, verse 41, 42, he says, but the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. One thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Martha was dedicated to honoring Jesus by service. Mary was dedicated to honoring Jesus, glorifying Jesus by sitting. Now again, fast forward just a few, some time in just a few months, and there we see them together again, Mary and Martha's house. This time, though, Lazarus is freshly raised from the dead. He still has that clean, fresh smell. And once again, there is this get-together going on, and Jesus is there once again with his disciples, and they're eating, and there are all these guests out there, and Martha once again is serving everybody as she possibly can. But this time, there is no sign of Mary anywhere. She's not sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's not mingling among the crowds. She's not helping Martha out at all. Where is she? She is conspicuously absent from all of this. And suddenly she does appear. It's like she comes out from behind some room somewhere. Everybody's lounging and enjoying themselves, eating the grapes, drinking the wine, having some fish, having a taste of bread. And Mary suddenly comes out of the room carrying a big jar of nard. Spikenard was a very costly ointment. And when I say costly, I mean costly. I don't mean somewhat costly, I mean extremely costly. It was used for burials or to make rich people's perfumes. It came all the way from the Himalayas. It was rare, it was expensive, and Mary used it to dedicate Jesus, to honor him, to glorify Jesus, preparing him for his burial. And she poured out this ointment on his feet and then wiped his feet with her hair. John tells us that the ointment, that the smell, the fragrance of the ointment actually permeated throughout the entire house. It was a pound of this stuff. Nobody saw this coming. But one person actually got angry when it did. John tells us that Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" And we know that Judas didn't care about the poor. He was the keeper of the money. We know that he wanted to line his pocket with his money. But what he does is he gives us an understanding of how expensive this spikenard, this nard, really was. Because a denarii was a day's wage. And Judas tells us that this is 300 denarii worth. 300 days worth of wages for this nard. Now we need to stop for a moment because it's easy to go, well, let's calculate how much is a denarii worth now, how much would it have been, it's like, okay, so it's a few bucks. No, we need to understand, let's put ourselves in that place. It's 300 days worth of wages. So let's think about that in American terms. Because the average American adult makes about $120 a day. If you think about that and you multiply that by 300 days, it's $36,000 that was used to anoint the feet of Jesus. And she just gave it over like it was nothing. First, Mary broke tradition when she sat at the feet of Jesus. But Mary broke the bank when she anointed those same feet. Judas's complaint was not simply that the ointment was wasted on Jesus' feet, but if we really look closely, Judas's complaint was, why was she holding on to this ointment when she could have gone and sold it and given it to the poor? And again, we know that wasn't his motive. But he has the objection that many people would have. Why are you holding on to this money that could have been used for something else? Why were you holding on for it so long? But again, Jesus comes to Mary's defense. He says, the poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me. Once again, Mary had chosen wisely. It's as if almost that Mary is the only one that really grasped how worthy Jesus was. He was worthy to sit at his feet and worthy to anoint them. Mary had chosen wisely. She dedicated her wealth to the glory of God. And I have to say here, just as a caution, that when I bring up that we are to dedicate our money to the glory of God, I don't necessarily mean that we give all of our money to the church. That's not the same thing. Certainly, a biblical church seeks to glorify God in how she stewards God's money that comes from God's people. There are a lot of ways to glorify God with our wealth that don't involve the local church. So if we go back to see what Solomon says in chapter 3, verses 9 through 10, there he says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all of your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Now that word for honor there, it really actually has the same meaning as glory. It's the word kibbad, which actually it means, it comes, all of these from the same root that basically means heaviness, weightiness. It means that when one displays the glory of God, or when God displays his own glory, he is displaying how weighty he is. In essence, when we do it, we are displaying that we are living for God, under God, by God, in God, that we are then doing so in a weighty manner. He's not some big guy upstairs, flippant. It's not who he is. God is weighty. He's heavy. When we worship God, we worship him joyfully, but also soberly, because he is weighty. When we utilize our wealth, we utilize it with heaviness. The way that we use our wealth displays absolutely what we believe about God. Is he a big deal to us, or is he of minimal consequence? Solomon included our first fruits with the offerings, with our wealth. It is our wealth, our possessions, not just the income that we have, not just the money in our bank, but all of our possessions. But it is also our income. He says this is to be dedicated for the glory of God. It is to be handed over to him because it's not really ours in the first place. And he says that if we will do that, the general truth, the general fact of the matter is that if we use our wealth for God's glory, we receive it back plenty in order to satisfy our every need. There are exceptions to the rule, but that's the general truth. That's the general rule. So we then are to take our wealth and dedicate it for the glory of God. That's the first action that we need to constantly be taking. Second one, similar. In fact, I would say, probably falls under the umbrella of that, is that we use our wealth for God's giftings. Giving to the glory of God might seem a little intangible. So this is more of some tangibleness to it. We can touch this, we can feel this, we can get to the idea of this. I mean, certainly, right, Mary's dedication of the ointment to Jesus, that was for the glory of God, but we would look at that and go, well, Jesus no longer walks on earth. God is a spirit. We have the Holy Spirit within us. If we're following Mary's example, there is no physical person at which we can break open some expensive spikenard and anoint the feet. Christ is in heaven. So then how do we do this? How do we glorify God? And we do so by dedicating it for God's gifting. The Bible helps us out with this second one as well. So around 901 BC, King Ben-Hadad, who was the king of Syria, has come down into Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and has besieged the capital city of Syria. King Jehoram is there within this city, besieged by the Syrians, and because they are besieged, they are starving. It doesn't take long before they begin to get extremely hungry. They then run out of food, and because they have run out of food, they have to somehow figure out how to produce food, and so they resort to cannibalism, the eating of their own children. There is an argument when Jehoram was walking through the town between two mothers because that he stopped him. King Jehoram, we made an agreement yesterday that we would eat my son then and that we would eat her son today. She's backing out of the agreement. Make her give up her son so we may eat. Grieving the heart of Jehoram and anyone who would have heard that. Elisha is then sent for because things are really bad. Think about this. The people would eat anything and everything that they could. In fact, again, the text tells us that they sold a donkey's head for 80 shekels of silver to eat. Today, that would again be about $176 for a donkey's head. Raise your hand if you want to eat donkey head for dinner. It's a delicacy. Yeah, it doesn't work, does it? That doesn't help out, does it, at all? They would scoop up bird dung. They would sell that for 5 shekels, or the equivalent of about $11 today. I would have a problem eating escargot, let alone bird dung. That's how hungry they were, though. Elisha comes on the scene and he says, by this time tomorrow, you will get fine flour. And he says that it's a seah of flour. You'll get a seah of fine flour, and it'll cost you 2 shekels. A seah of flour is about 7 pounds of flour. And it'll cost you 2 shekels. In other words, it'll cost you about $4 for 7 pounds of flour. Wouldn't it be nice, ladies, if we could get 7 pounds of flour for $4? A fine flour. That would be so awesome. And he says, and by this time tomorrow, you'll get 14 pounds of barley flour for 2 shekels, for $4. In other words, by this time tomorrow, there's going to be so much food, everything drops in price. Talk about supply and demand. Nobody believes him. But the next day, there are 4 lepers. And they're outside of the city because they're not allowed to be in this city. They're in the leper colony, and they think to themselves, because they're starving, right? They're starving themselves. They think to themselves, hey, what difference does it make if we starve to death or go and ask the Syrians for food and they just kill us? Either way, we're dead. So they go to the Syrian camp to ask them for food, and lo and behold, all the Syrians are gone. And they left everything behind. They had heard in the middle of the night chariots and armies and trumpets blowing, and it scared them out of their wits, and they ran from the camp back to Syria, and they left everything behind. And the lepers look, and there's nobody there, and they go in the tents, and there's all this food, and they begin to eat to their heart's content. And when they are done eating, then they start grabbing silver and gold and new clothes, and they're taking it back to their camp until finally we see this in 2 Kings. Then they said to one another, "We're not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." And they do. And all of Samaria gets to eat, just like Elisha had said. These men realized that the wealth that they had found was not only for themselves, but was a gift from God to give to those in need. And here's the kicker. Did the Samaritans, those in Samaria, did they deserve the food and the gold and the silver and the clothes? And the answer is absolutely not. Not in the least. It was because of their idolatry that they had been surrounded in the first place, that God had sent the Syrian army in the first place. They did not deserve this grace from God. They deserved to die of hunger. In fact, Moses even warned the people in Deuteronomy 28 that this is exactly what would happen. But in God's grace, He provided a wealth of food and money and clothes to these 4 unclean lepers, who then saw the need to share it with those who were in the city. These undeserving, idolatrous people. Unto what end? For what purpose? That they would see the grace of God and repent. And if you read the whole story, you find out they received the grace of God, but they would not repent. Of course, we would rightly see this not simply as wealth of money, but also wealth that comes from knowing Jesus Christ, our Savior. Just before this siege took place, we also read the story of Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, who was diagnosed with leprosy. Naaman is actually said to be the reason that God had blessed Syria with all their conquests. He had blessed Naaman, therefore he had blessed Syria with all their conquests. And in one of their battles against Israel, Naaman actually had kidnapped a little girl and took her home with him to be his wife's slave. And when he had developed leprosy, by God's providence, there he had an Israeli slave girl. And we see in 2 Kings 5, she said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." That wealth of knowledge of salvation had to be shared. Even with her kidnapper, her enslaver. Before that was the raising of the Shulamite widow's son. Only one person could do that. Of course, Elisha could do that. But the knowledge then had to be spread and understood that he had the power. Much of what happens in 1st and 2nd Kings is to show that God is the God of salvation. But it takes his people who know the value, who know the wealth of that good news to share it and spread it with others. Today, that salvation is not simply physical salvation, it is spiritual salvation. It is eternal salvation that is found only in Jesus Christ. Because only He can fill our besieged, starving souls. Only He can restore our leprous hearts. Only He can raise our spiritually dead selves. As Isaiah said about His sacrificial death, by His stripes we are healed. And so we have this wealth of knowledge of who Christ is and what He has done that must not be kept to ourselves, but must be shared with those who are in need, those, of course, who are undeserving. But we also have a wealth of possessions that helps to open up those doors for the gospel communication. It's really what we've been called to do. It's been what we've called to give. We dedicate our wealth for God's gifting to others. Paul pointed this out to the Ephesians, to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20. His final words to these men, to these elders, had to do with working in order to acquire wealth so that he could share it with those in need, so he could give it away. He says, I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me. In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how He Himself said it is more blessed to give than to receive. We work in order to be God's gifting to others. It's the same sentiment that he had when he wrote to the Corinthians. He says, He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous. That's the purpose. You will be enriched. You will have this wealth with the purpose of giving, to being generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So we share our wealth. We are not stingy with our wealth. We share our wealth, being God's gift. This is the one time to think that, you know what, I'm God's gift to others, right? We share our wealth to be God's gift to others. We are His gifters. And in so doing, we glorify Jesus and the Father, both. Because one of the last things that Jesus taught comes out of Matthew 25. Then the righteous will answer Him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? Or when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in person and visit you? And the King will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. It's one thing for Mary to anoint Jesus' feet in person. It's much harder for us, isn't it, to remember that those people that are out there that don't deserve it need our wealth. And when we give them the help that they need, it's just like doing it to Jesus. We're performing the same act that Mary performed. But it is not only that we dedicate our wealth for God's gifting or to God's glory, but we dedicate it for God's greatness as well. We want His greatness to be seen, and we want His greatness to be known. Again, this is a common theme that's throughout Proverbs. The reason that we dedicate our wealth to God is for God's greatness to be seen and to be known. When we dedicate our wealth, it means that we no longer hold on to it as if it was our own. It means that we give it away when called by God to do so. It means that we must then trust God to give to us as we give to others. It also means that we must trust God when He ceases to give so much to us that we actually might have a sign from God to pull back in our giving to others. It can work both ways. Remember the verse that Michael read, the very first one? Whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a leaf. We don't trust the gift, right? We trust the giver. We don't trust the benefits. We trust the benefactor. We don't trust the goods. We trust the only one who is good. And we look at what Solomon wrote about those who trust in their wealth. And we see something akin to this that we see about what happens when you trust in your wealth. He says this in Proverbs 10, a rich man's wealth is his strong city. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. And it's tempting to look at this, and we've been talking about Proverbs and how different parallelisms there are, and it's tempting to look at this and to think, okay, this is the parallel of opposites here. We're talking about rich, and we're talking about poor, and we're talking about a strong city, and we're talking about ruin. Therefore, it's a parallel of opposites, but it's really not. It's actually similar. These are talking about the same things from different ends, but it's talking about the same idea. So we don't need to be fooled. We don't want to be ruined, of course. And therefore, we ought not seek after poverty. So many people will romanticize because I don't want to be rich. I don't want to be like that rich, young ruler who needed to get through the eye of the needle and then he can't and he's not going out. I don't want to be rich. And so we swing that pendulum all the way over here, and so many people romanticize poverty as if that's the answer. He says, don't do that, because poverty is the poor man's ruin. The same idea is there for the rich. The rich man's wealth is his strong city. It's his refuge. It's his place to run and to hide. He uses it when he's in trouble. He uses it to get himself out of jams. And Solomon isn't saying that this is how it ought to be, but he is saying that this is typically how it is. The more wealth that one has, the more that he relies upon that wealth. It's his strong city, it's his strong tower, it's his refuge. He trusts in his riches to get him out of the situations that he is in. If this is what he does, then he is making much of his wealth and little of his God. And many Christians will sing the song, "How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God," when they really ought to be singing, because it's really more in their heart, "How great is my wealth. Sing with me, how great is my wealth," because that's what we trust in. We trust in our retirement accounts. We trust in our jobs, in our salaries. We trust in the stock market. It's no wonder that Jesus says no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Mammon, which is more like wealth. You will either serve God with your wealth, or you will serve wealth as your God. It's as simple as that. If you and I are serious about dedicating our wealth to God, then we must take the necessary action to dedicate it for God's greatness. Trust God, not your wealth. Trust God to show off his greatness, not your acumen for acquiring wealth, not your ability to make a dollar stretch. Because that's actually trusting in your wealth still. I appreciate what Tim Keller wrote in Counterfeit Gods, Men Who Are Going to Our Study. Listen up. He says this, he says, greed hides itself from the victim. The money god's modus operandi includes blindness to your own heart. Jesus warns people far more about greed than about sex. Yet almost no one thinks that they are guilty of it, guilty of greed. Therefore, Keller says, we should all begin with the working hypothesis that this could easily be a problem for me. If greed hides itself so deeply, no one should be confident that it is not a problem for them. Beloved, I think most Christians today would say that they have dedicated their wealth to God, when in fact, we are just blind to our own slavery to our wealth. Rather than using our wealth to serve God, our wealth uses us to serve it. Carlo Ponzi was a man who was a slave to money and to his own wealth. It threw him into all sorts of sinful acts, plunged him into ruin and destruction. But by the grace of God, what? There go we. Most of us, if not all of us here, would say that we don't live for the almighty dollar, and yet, in very subtle ways, we show that we do. Again, we're not supposed to romanticize poverty. But very few people, correct me if I'm wrong, come see me after, I will make an apology, but very few people seem to go, I just daydream all day about what I could do if I just had less money. All the good. I sit there and I just think about all the good I could do if I didn't have as much money as I have right now. But we do often go, sometimes I daydream about all the good that I could do if I had more money. And then all of a sudden we get money. Maybe for our birthday or for Christmas or something else. And we get this money, and what do? We do the very good things that we were just imagining that we could do. No. We typically buy goods. We don't do the good, but we buy goods. So as we close out this portion of our walk in Proverbs, we've seen what it means to dedicate our wealth to God. There are three necessary actions that we should do if we're going to dedicate our money and our wealth to God. We do it for God's glory, we do it for God's gifting, and we do it for God's greatness. And in reality, those last two really fall under that first one, just more tangible ways to glorify God with our wealth. God is not calling us to minimalism, but neither is He calling us to opulence. He's called us to be His steward of His wealth that He has graciously placed in our care. We dedicate that wealth to Him because in reality, it's His. That's really what it means to put aside the American dream and start living the heavenly one. Like those who are given talents, we will one day give an account for all that has been entrusted to us. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. Let's pray.